You signed up for our webinar and you couldn't attend. Would you like the gist of the topic in 15 minutes if you set a meeting with an expert? And in many cases, they were able to get this meeting and to start this conversation about the product. Bottom of funnel webinars would attract people who are more likely to buy, but because there are fewer of these people overall, the top of funnel webinars, in the cases which I investigated, generated higher benefit for the company's pipeline. Assignments of contacts who attended live webinar seems to be more likely to generate opportunities. How do we measure the success of the program? There are ways to measure the webinar success as a last touch. So for example, in one of the companies where I worked, the last touch metric indicated that only 1% of booked pipeline was fully attributed to webinars, or 3% of pipeline generated, not necessarily booked deals, but the pipeline generated were attributed to webinars. Both top of funnel webinars, thought leadership webinar, and technical demonstrations were attended by exactly the same number of C-level executives, and they had exactly the same level of engagement.
So I guess let's just get started. I mean, I think you have an amazing slide deck to share. I guess we'll talk about the webinar programs, missteps, blocking, SaaS pipeline potential. So go for it.
Absolutely. First of all, for years, we probably were talking about how dead the email is. And then after the pandemic, we also discovered that webinars may not be performing as well as they did during the pandemic. In many cases, companies thought, okay, webinars may not be the best tactic for us. However, just like email, webinars are pretty much alive and well, and companies can take advantage of them. The most important fact is to discover, is it a right strategy for your company, even if everybody else might be thinking that email is dead or the webinars are no longer performing. If it works for your company, it doesn't matter. And in general, I would talk about a few nuances of the webinar program, which better not to overlook. This is a collection of some of the mistakes which I did in the past during my 5 jobs where I was managing the webinar program as part of my demand gen responsibilities. And this is a collection of my mistakes and some other aspects which I observed and could be done a little bit better. Some of them could be strategy clarification and avoidance of the lonesome webinar, what sometimes happen. There are new nuances on measuring success and platforms and integrations, what we can think about them, and also even some mistakes which I made in experimentation and testing.
Okay, it's just one quick question while we get to it. So in terms of demand gen, how much of your budgets in your experience have you spent on webinars versus the other channels?
I would say about 20%. In some companies, I would spend on the webinar activity. Usually, it is a part of the larger initiatives, absolutely. In this presentation, I'm concentrating on the webinar channel itself as it has its nuances. But definitely, it was not the only channel which I was using in the past, and it has its role in overall strategy. It does have a few nuances which we can emphasize and take advantage of.
Okay, just go for it.
Strategy clarification. Webinar is technically not a webinar. Webinar is a channel. So it could be technically anything. It could be a webinar from the top of the funnel. It could be a conversation about industry best practices. It could be a testimonial of one of the best customers. It could be a demo of the product, and all of it could be just a webinar. In many cases, when companies are thinking about the webinar program and webinar platform as part of their demand generation activities, there is a definition of what expectation is and what the company wants to do with the program. And sometimes it is not that clearly defined. And at this point, I am not talking about the strategy and the value and what the right strategy and the wrong strategy could be, but just the clarity of the strategy, whatever it is. And if you think about an example, we will produce X webinars per month. Sometimes it could work, sometimes it may not. You could clarify it a little bit when you say we will produce X top of funnel educational webinars per month for Y audience segment, but it still may or may not be enough. There is a very good test which you can apply, the piece of paper test. This test is very useful as an application, not only for the webinar program, but pretty much for any kind of program which you are making. It's very useful to apply to the webinar initiatives. In this case, you would say, if we will produce X pieces of paper per month, does it have enough clarity? Probably not. Or we will produce X top of funnel educational piece of paper per month for Y audience segment. This is a little better, but depending on the company, depending on the segment, it still may not quite be clear enough. And the clarity is particularly important when there are changes in strategy or changes in management. Other aspects to not overlook on strategy clarification and alignment opportunities are related to a few points. Webinar series, it's fantastic opportunity to do webinar series. Then everybody knows what to expect. It's easier to promote the webinar series as one after the other. But here there is a good opportunity to double check, are resources defined and how promotions will be prioritized if there are any other conflict in promotions. Webinars are often dependent on email. And email is an excellent channel to promote some other marketing activities. So if the company is planning a variety of marketing activities and webinar program is one of them, and it may not be quite the top prioritized program, it might or might not make sense to have this program at that time. Because if it could not be promoted, it may not make sense to invest resources into the program. And also how resources are defined. At one of my jobs, there was a change in the organization, and one of the people who was finding the speakers for the webinars and was serving as a moderator and the industry expert left the company. As a result, I was a little vacuum, which my colleague and I filled with Vanessa's friends speaking at webinars. It was good that the pipeline generated based on Vanessa's friends speaking at the webinars, but was it the best opportunity? Maybe not. Maybe there would be a better approach to do, as both me and my colleague were relatively new to the business. Another point is product launches. It's a fantastic opportunity to use webinars as a part of the product launch promotions. However, if the program, the webinar program, relies only on product launches and on product marketing managers to run the webinars, it might result in too many webinars at one point when it is not quite possible to promote all of them, or too few in a different time point when an opportunity to promote something to the database is not quite used. This is another point to consider when you're trying to maximize what webinar program can do for your company. And then some companies have customer-centric webinars as a separate part of the marketing. Sometimes it's part of the customer marketing area. And in many cases, it's a treasure of content for prospect-facing activities. But not coordinating it could be also a loss of opportunities. Again, in one company, I found the situation when we suddenly discovered, should have discovered earlier, that there was an excellent webinar targeted to customers. So there was a mad dash to repurpose this webinar to make it wider and more applicable to the demand generation for the prospects and wider promotion and exposure. It was great to do, but better to plan. And something might be missed, and you don't want to miss opportunities where you can get more benefit with less effort. Another point is global initiatives. If you are in a global organization, sometimes regional programs are run based on implementation of and localization of the main corporate program, usually run in the United States. However, in some cases, the regional programs might be rather independent, and they might talk about very, very specific nuances of regional markets, which often not applicable to other territories. However, if these programs use some of other materials, such as videos, case studies, webinars, they could be repurposed independently, and it could save you time and allow you to do more other promotional activities beneficial for the business. So, for example, if your colleagues in Amsterdam is working on a program, on a webinar, 10 points how to do X, specific to the industry, it might be relatively easy to repurpose on 3 points how to do X or 5 points how to do X for United States or for maybe other region, because it would be relatively easy for the speaker to take all these materials and localize it as a webinar. And it might save time for the demand generation marketer and allow to do other initiatives to generate pipeline. And then overall marketing plan and webinar programs. If something is changing or strategy is becoming a little bit different, it's great to make sure that everything aligns, everything makes sense, and maybe to try a piece of paper test. Because we always try to make sure that everything makes sense, everything works together. But once in a while, it does happen that we end up with a lonesome webinar.
Okay, so before getting to a lonesome webinar, so I have some few questions I wanted to ask. And in terms of promotional part of webinars, so how much lead time would you give for any webinar in terms of promotion? So is it like a month before you start promoting a webinar? How do you sort of like plan for that?
It usually depends on the audience and on the type of the industry. In some cases, in some industries, you might get the most of the promotion you want in about a week before the webinar. It could be a couple of the emails. In most of the industries, what I discovered, it's about 2 weeks. If you can send a couple of the emails per week, it's about 2 weeks and it's about 4 emails. And if you start promoting too early, then people might register but not necessarily attend. Or if you start promoting too late, you are leaving the opportunities on the table. However, the webinar is a fantastic channel to address something what is happening in the industry right now, because it's easier than create even a blog post in some cases. And in this case, it's okay to have, I don't know, 2 days promotion or even 1 day promotion if the webinar is addressing whatever the topic is everybody talking in the industry.
And okay, in terms of promotional, you mentioned email, 4 emails, 2 weeks, which is a very great insight. Which promotional, channel would work better in addition to email? Is it LinkedIn promotional? Is it messaging? Like which, or a mix of all of those? So which one do you recommend?
It also depends on the industry on what is the main medium where the target audience lives. It could be organic LinkedIn. Paid LinkedIn does not always generate return on investment from the webinar promotions, and it's now more used and more recommended, particularly by Chris Walker from Refine Labs, as a source of ungated content rather than the webinar. But anything what could be done to promote it through the channels where the target audience is. LinkedIn, put it on the website, promote it on the homepage of the website, on the specific pages of the website. If the target audience might be on the Facebook, for example, for the SMB cases, maybe it's a good idea to promote it on Facebook. Another option is to provide sales organization an opportunity to promote the webinar, to provide an outreach program where the webinar could be promoted by sales reps to somebody in their network. In this case, I usually do not expect to generate too much registrants from the sales promotions. I think the highest number of registrants ever generated by sales promotion based on a spiff in one of the companies where I worked was 9%. 9% of the total. So it probably won't be your top source, but sales organization can use a webinar to remind some of the customers, some of the prospects they might be chasing that, hey, we have a useful content and maybe you want to check it out.
Okay, that's awesome. So in terms of, let's say you have a list of 100 people and you're doing the promotion for, and out of that 100, a certain number will register for it, and a certain number will actually show up for it, and a certain number will show some interest. Do you have any stats what those conversion rates are?
It also depends on the industry and sometimes on the platform. If you are using a relatively regular platform, usually I would expect about 30% to show up live. You can increase the number of people who show up live by promoting the webinar closer to the live date. However, there are some platforms such as BrightTalk, if you are targeting IT audience, where the webinar is available for a long time on the platform. In this case, the number of people who use the webinar on demand might actually be much higher than the number of people who view it live, because it's available and IT professionals are searching for the content to get educated. So it depends on the industry and the target audience, but I would say if you are just running a regular standard webinar program, 30% would be a good benchmark to start. And then for some industries, it will be higher. For some industries, it will be lower. If you are targeting your customers and trying to promote whatever topic you want to your customers, the number of webinar attendees live could be up to 50% or even higher than 50%.
Okay, and in terms of real demand generation, like in terms of capturing the interest and the people who actually end up buying your product. So do you feel like webinars work versus other channels?
Webinars complement. And another point is to discuss the metrics. How do we measure the success of the program, which we will get to in a couple of slides. There are ways to measure the webinar success as a last touch. And in this case, it may not show as much pipeline generation. So for example, in one of the companies where I worked, the last touch metric indicated that only 1% of booked pipeline was fully attributed to webinars, or 3% of pipeline generated, not necessarily booked deals, but the pipeline generated were attributed to webinars. So you might be asking yourself, okay, if it is just 1% of bookings attributed to webinars, should I even do the program? Should I concentrate more on the paid search? Should I concentrate more on other things? And this is where other metrics might be more beneficial. And when you are trying to evaluate if you should be doing this tactic or another tactic, how is this program, this activity can be incorporated in a wider set of marketing activities?
Okay, one more question before so live webinars versus recorded webinars, which one are your favorite and why?
If you're thinking about live webinar where the audience is live, and pre-recorded webinar when you're pre-recording the webinar and then it's projected to the audience, I would say it doesn't matter. In some cases, people might be worried that there is a need to polish or adjust the webinar before it is presented to the wider audience. But in some cases, the material is so timely. For example, if it is addressing specific event in the industry, that the speed of information and interaction with the prospects could be more valuable than, unfortunately, a couple of snafus which otherwise could have been edited out.
Oh, okay, that's awesome. So, loads of webinar, just go for it.
Okay, thank you. Once in a while, even if we took care of pretty much everything, it happens to be that our webinar is rather lonesome. Only one webinar does not relate to anything in our marketing activities, no matter how much we try to prevent it. And in this case, what you can do, you can probably repurpose it as a blog post, if it makes sense. And you can slice the webinar on snippets of videos, which could be used in a variety of places. However, if you think about creating a connected webinar, it can give you more opportunities with not as much more additional work. So if you start from the ebook, for example, it could be a topic which has an ebook or report. And after that, you have a webinar talking about the same topic. So you already have the topic. And after that, you have a demo webinar related to the same topic, or more of the bottom of the funnel webinar, which could be a customer testimonial, or which could be how to select software of this type. That becomes the entire topic. So you can have a couple of blog posts, you can have a video snippets, you can put all of this information on your topical web page to help your SEO and to help engagement of your audience. And in some cases, you can actually start with the webinar. Trends webinars are fantastic. Trends, papers, blog posts, everybody loves trends at the beginning of the year. So you can start with a webinar to make your life a little bit easier. So you might have one webinar with customers, maybe to discuss industry trends, and then another webinar with internal experts to discuss industry trends. And then based on these webinars, you can create a report talking about the industry trends, which would combine all of these materials, which you already generated just by executing your planned marketing tactics. And all of it could generate nice number of video snippets and a couple of blog posts to promote all of it. So all of these materials could feed the other marketing efforts and help you work less and get more out of your topic.
Okay, that's awesome. So just a few questions around that. So do you think there should be some gating strategies around webinar, or it should be like free for everybody right now?
I do think that gate is beneficial for the webinar. Why? Because this is the naturally gated piece of content. And as we are talking more about ungating top of funnel content, and we are trying to touch on the dark social where everything is available and people can nurture themselves to the point until they are ready to buy and then come to the website of the company. The webinar is a naturally gateable piece because you want to participate live. And if you want to participate live, in this case, you do register. And the registration allows to measure and see what is working and what is not working. So it has an additional benefit which companies can use.
But in terms of pre-recorded, in terms of on-demand webinars, so is it something we should get?
Pre-recording, yes, you can definitely pre-record the webinar and run it later. Usually it doesn't allow, on some platforms, it doesn't allow you to do polls of your target audience. And polls could be used for demand generation very, very effectively.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, measuring success now.
Measuring success.
Yeah.
Sometimes webinars, as I mentioned, measure it as a last touch effort. And if they're measured as last touch effort, you would see a single percentage points contribution to the bookings or to the pipeline, which might indicate that it's not as effective channel as you might want. The better probably measurement of success is the influence. And influence could be taken as anybody who watched the webinar before becoming an opportunity at a certain period of time and after becoming an opportunity after a certain period of time, depending on the sales cycle of the business. This would give you a better metric of how important it is the information provided by the webinar program to your opportunities. This is a little bit better. The best metric, which I actually could not get in many of my previous jobs, is the velocity. Webinars rumor it, or there is some data indicating that they help with deal velocity. So if number of deals is moving through the pipeline with certain speed, but those deals who participate in webinars move through the pipeline faster, which would definitely encourage that investment of marketing and demand generation efforts into the webinar program. And then there is also an opportunity to ask somebody else in the company if they have any relevant data. A little chart which you can see on the slide right now is actually the chart which a BDR organization or SDR organization sent to me on one of my jobs, totally unprovoked. And what it showed is that webinar attendees assignments to SDRs performed much better for the conversion to opportunity than any other assignments which SDRs received. Okay, here is my chart. Even if the webinars are contributing based on the last touch only 1% to the book pipeline, I can see that the BDRs are getting more benefit out of it and becoming more effective.
Oh, okay. So in this graph, just to maybe, I think we can sort of like get a bit deeper into that. Yeah. So what you're saying, sort of showing is that the people who have attended, so they have the highest conversion rate, okay, versus the people, even though versus the people a benchmark, and even the people who were who watch it on demand still are doing better than the rest, right?
Yes, this chart indicates that based on a benchmark, which would be an average of all assignments which BDRs received, assignments of contacts who attended live webinar seems to be more likely to generate opportunities. And even people who registered for the webinar but did not attend, when assigned to the BDRs to follow up, were more likely to generate opportunities than an average assignment to the BDRs.
Okay, that's awesome. That's awesome. Okay.
And the point of this chart is you may not have, as a demand generation manager or a marketer, you may not have the data on your side, but maybe somebody else in the organization does. And maybe it's possible to find this data to see if you should invest more time in the specific program, such as a webinar program.
Okay, that's awesome. That's awesome.
And then one of my favorite mistakes in measuring success of any campaign or a webinar is to create a very, 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 very complex dashboard. Somehow, if I have access to the data in Salesforce, if I can tell how many cups of coffee on the morning a prospect could have before becoming an opportunity, I will add it to my dashboard. And in many cases, my dashboards were actually longer than the Salesforce allows. This is actually not necessary based on all of my experience. You may not need to spend all this time to create this type of grandiose dashboards with minute details. There are different types of dashboards. The program, high-level program dashboard, and it relates to the marketing campaigns as a webinar program, where you can see the most important metrics. And then you could use a diagnostic view, something you would see as a marketer to make sure that everything is okay. And the good example of diagnostic, I would say, actually comes from a different program, not necessarily the webinar program. At one point, I was working on Google Display Network with a wonderful agency. And I had a diagnostic dashboard in Google Analytics. I created a little exploration where I saw what was happening. And I suddenly noticed that people were converting for my program coming from Tbilisi. Why would they be interested? Looking deeper in the setup, we discovered that instead of Georgia state, it was accidentally Georgia country, what definitely indicated why people were converting from Tbilisi. So there are two aspects of the dashboard. One aspect is actually top high-level performance of the program, and the second aspect is purely diagnostic. And the diagnostic part may not need to even be shared with the rest of the organization. It could be kept within the marketing, operations of marketing, demand gen marketing to monitor the program. And then for sales, what do you give sales to follow up on any marketing initiatives? And I also discovered in many, many situations that minimum necessary information is the best. And it pertains to webinars, or it can pertain to any marketing campaign. At one point, I had an opportunity to have pretty much all the webinar activity. What kind of questions were asked? How much time people spent watching the webinar? What kind of materials they downloaded? All of it was available to sales, and they didn't use it. So in the future, I learned to make sure that I send the absolute minimum necessary information. This person linked to Salesforce, to the account, to the person's spot, attended this webinar, asked this question. You might want to incorporate it in your follow-up. That's it. This was the most beneficial information type which sales found useful. Otherwise, when I would send more information, deeply intricate information. In some cases, it was not clear if they even saw this type of information because it was just too complex.
Okay, so still, I guess we talked about the KPIs and the matrices. Which one are your favorites? Like, if you have to pick, like, okay, these are the 5 absolute favorite KPIs that I actually look for a successful webinar, what would those be?
I would look at the bookings of the program, because usually it would be, the webinar would be part of the bigger program of some kind of a campaign with a specific topic. And if I could associate the bookings generated by this campaign, that would be my favorite topic. But from the webinar as a separate channel, as a separate program, I would use probably influenced, because it would show the most of the engagement with the program.
Okay, that's awesome. And one more question. In terms of, you've mentioned that there are, so you can do a webinar for top, middle, and bottom, and all of those. So for that, does your selection of KPIs change?
I would say, if you think about the marketing campaign, it would have a top of funnel webinar, it would have a bottom of funnel webinar. But it's also interesting, and this is actually on the next slide, it's also interesting to see if top of funnel webinars are contributing more to the pipeline or the bottom of funnel webinars. And in some cases, companies believe that if the bottom of funnel activity is used, it could be a webinar, it could be a blog post, it could be a white paper, it's more likely to generate pipeline. And I was fortunate to have enough data and enough statistically significant data in 2 of my companies where I work to see if it was true. And in both companies, actually, it was the top of funnel webinars, which were not necessarily talking about the product the company was selling, which generated or influenced the higher number of opportunities and the larger pipeline in dollar sense. So yes, bottom of funnel webinars would attract people who are more likely to buy, but because there are fewer of these people overall, the top of funnel webinars, in the cases which I investigated, generated higher benefit for the company and a higher benefit for the company's pipeline. However, each company might be different. And if you look at the data which you have, it would be the best approach to measurement.
Okay, that's awesome. We continue. Okay.
Awesome. Another point is what you can get out of the webinar program, because it naturally has more data, as in some cases some other programs. You can see what kind of audience is interested in certain topics. In one of my jobs, there was a guess that C-level audience would not be interested in technical demos. And it seems to make sense. So technical demos were not promoted to a C-level audience in any way. But because all of this information was available to pretty much anybody to watch on demand, and the data was available, after the analysis, it was clear that both top of funnel webinars, thought leadership webinar, and technical demonstrations were attended by exactly the same number of C-level executives, and they had exactly the same level of engagement. So after this investigation, I was able to start promoting the technical demonstrations to higher level audience too. It wouldn't be the only one, come to technical demos, but it could be one of the calls to action promoted to this type of audience. Another beneficial aspect which you can get from the webinars is if you are targeting persona X, but suddenly you are seeing an increased engagement from the persona Y, it might be a good idea to talk with the product marketing management. They will probably see if the new persona is interested in the product when they analyze the purchase data and who is purchasing the product. But engagement with the topic and the webinar, because we have more of the data, could be an early indicator which product marketing management could investigate. And another point which I mentioned already, top of funnel webinars versus bottom of funnel webinars, what would generate more of the pipeline? Because it probably would take as much effort to produce a bottom of funnel webinar as to produce the top of funnel webinar. But if one of them is more effective, you can optimize your efforts. I also heard a couple of times in my life that, okay, we will improve our webinar engagement, we will improve the effectiveness of our webinar program, and we will include more customers into our webinars as speakers. Is it true or is it not? This is another interesting point to investigate. And I was able to investigate in a couple of companies in the past too. This is the data from one of the companies where I had sufficient amount of information. And as you can see, there is a comparison of external speakers, webinars based on invitation of external speakers such as analysts and customers, and just internal speakers. And there wasn't that much difference. So it's more difficult for the company to invite an external speaker. It's sometimes easier to create an engaging presentation with an internal expert. And this knowledge can save you time, again, but caveat, it may not quite be exactly the same for your audience or your product. So measurement is essential. This is another.
Okay, I have a few questions around that. So here we are talking about. You mentioned that the top of funnel webinars are doing better. Is it because of the fact that the top of funnels are mostly about value and it's about education and it's about teaching, and less selling? So is this the case that people are sort of like attracted to that topic more?
My guess, you're right. One of the aspects, we do know that only about 5% of the target audience are currently in the market, and about 95 are not in market, so they will not be attracted by the bottom of funnel webinar, but they might want to check out the top of funnel webinar. And it might be the reason why they will remember about your company after the webinar when they are in market. So as the webinar or any other type of material attracts wider audience, it's likely that it could influence pipeline better. But again, I would check your own data before making any type of conclusion. I found this conclusion interesting because it was counterintuitive. The same as external speakers, participation of external speakers. At one case, I even had a very, very popular in the industry speaker who was added to a webinar later. And I had a couple of promotions without this speaker and a couple of promotions after the speaker was added. And I didn't notice significant increase in interest to the topic. So it most likely the topic rather than the speaker, unless the speaker is a celebrity which attracts audience just by himself or herself.
Okay, excellent. Okay, thank you.
And this is another interesting chart. In one of my companies where I worked, we measured out of 21 webinars promoted to the same audience over 6 months, 82% of attendees attended only 1 or 2 webinars. And we were worried, oh, should we repeat this topic? We just did it like 3 months ago. If we did it 3 months ago, it's perfectly reasonable to repeat the topic, because the probability that whoever might be interested in the topic already attended it is not that high. But again, it needs to be tested based on the data. But if you realize that you can repeat interesting topics, it will optimize your program. It will allow you to generate more pipeline with less efforts and invest these efforts in additional demand generation effort.
Okay, that's awesome. So one related question I just wanted to ask is around the delivery of the webinar, because obviously it's about keeping the user engaged for that particular topic and for that particular duration. What are some of your tips and things that you found that really worked well?
What I found works well is exactly what you are doing, asking questions during the webinar. Sometimes companies do the presentation and then adjust a little time or save a little time for asking questions and having the discussion after the webinar. And this is where you see a drop in the attendance. So if you spread all the questions around the webinar presentation, this is the best for the engagement. So what you are doing is absolutely perfect. Another interesting aspect is polls. Everybody loves to see what everybody else is thinking. And if you are using polls, and polls show the information about the other people's voting, only after you vote, you have a higher number of people voting. And in some cases, you can actually structure the polls to give valuable information to sales, to follow up with people who might be getting closer to that decision point if they want to buy your product or not.
Okay, that's awesome. Thank you.
Platforms and integrations. Here are a few mistakes which I made personally in the past, and do not need to worry about, hopefully, after listening to this. You may not need a top webinar platform to generate pipeline. I was fortunate to work with very nice webinar platforms and the more basic ones. And in general, it's the topic, it's the engagement, it's what you put in the promotion of the webinar which generate the most success. So if you are a smaller company which is thinking about trying the webinar program, there are ways to do it easier and cheaper than investment in a high-end webinar platform. But there is also a conversation, there was a conversation in the industry about the company platform where you are running your own webinar versus the industry platform where you are hosting the webinar, for example, on BrightTalk for IT professionals, and you are driving all your database to the BrightTalk to register for your webinars. Some companies say, yes, why would I have two platforms if I am using BrightTalk, for example, anyway? And some companies might say, I would rather have two platforms because I have a very good, highly curated database, which I would rather not share with my competitors. And as soon as people are driven to some of the industry platforms, they are definitely exposed to the competitive webinars. And this is for the company to decide, for the marketing strategy to address. And one mistake which I made is complex integrations. Sometimes it is possible to send everything to the sales force. How many cups of coffee the prospect had before the webinar? And it's so attractive. The data is so interesting, but it may not be used for sales, by sales. And it might actually extend the period of time required to integrate the program and to start running webinars on the platform. So it's a business decision to make how much information do you want to send to Salesforce and make available for sales versus how much efforts do you want to invest into integration of all the data points to the minor details. Think about it in advance and don't waste efforts on something which may not be used. I had in the past.
Okay. That's good.
Another point is experimentation and testing. And here are a couple of mistakes that yours truly made and recognized years later. Does that obnoxious CTA works? I love to put everywhere you can think of, talk with an expert, interested in whatever the company is selling, talk with an expert. If I can put it on my forehead, I would. But does it work? That was an interesting question. As part of the webinar program which I ran at one point, I was always had this question, and I would highly report this number of people. I had 5 hand raisers wanting to talk to sales. And after a year or two, I actually asked sales, how did this particular group do? They looked at me and said, they were weird. Weird how? They were weird. They did not necessarily want to buy the product. Okay, in this case, I dived into the data and discovered that only about 4% of those people who raised their hands were potential prospects. Only 2 were associated with any kind of opportunities, what was lower than an average webinar audience. 9% were direct competitors asking some bizarre questions, and 9% were service providers who were trying to sell something to the company. This is why they were weird from the perspective of the salespeople. I tried it in a few companies, and when I'm coming to the new organization, I usually try it because who knows? People are raising their hands. They want to speak with sales. And then when I ask sales, okay, how did they do? Very often I hear, oh, they were weird. At that point, I no longer look into the data. I just replace it with something else more useful for the business. It could be an invitation for the next webinar, works very well. It could be a downloadable material related to the webinar, but it looks like that the just call to action does not necessarily generate a good result. Another interesting approach is poll results. Sometimes, and this is a very good topic to discuss with a subject matter expert who is working on the webinar, and with a sales organization. Sometimes it is possible to structure the questions which are interesting enough, but also give sales information how to speak with this prospect. And these are very valuable questions. But again, they require coordination and cooperation between the expert who is presenting the webinar, particularly very technical topics, and the product marketing manager, marketer, and the sales organization. And another question, but if you want to promote a next webinar and you don't have the topic yet, what do you do? Usually, if you have a series of webinars, you can just say the next webinar in our series, just save your spot. It will be on your calendar, it will be convenient. In some cases, it's enough. At one point, I was worried that I needed a topic to promote the next webinar, but when I tried promoting it just with a general theme, and it generated enough registrants, it seemed to work well, and it seemed to be more beneficial than the obnoxious CTA, which I used to love so much. Another interesting tip which you might consider, one of the sales organizations with whom I worked had a very interesting approach to webinar follow-up. Usually, In some cases, I would prepare the sequence for sales, and I would send it after the webinar. Hey, here is the webinar slides, and by the way, if you're interested in the topic, let us know. We will talk. We will get you meeting with an expert. But one sales organization actually managed to get more meetings out of no shows than out of people who actually attended the webinar. What they did was quite brilliant. They actually had a conversation, something like that. Hey, you signed up for our webinar and you couldn't attend. Would you like the gist of the topic in 15 minutes if you set a meeting with an expert? And in many cases, they were able to get this meeting and to start this conversation about the product.
Oh, okay. That's nice.
And then we are all currently experimenting with AI, and I do too. From the perspective of using AI for webinars, unfortunately, we cannot quite yet tell it, run a webinar for us. Doesn't quite work this way. Maybe one day, not yet. But it's great for brainstorming titles. One of the excellent approach which I found is seed questions. Sometimes when you are working with subject matter experts in a very technical industries, it's difficult for a marketer to recommend seed questions for the webinar. And in many cases, when I would ask subject matter expert, they would look at me funny. I don't know what I need to ask myself and answer. Some excellent, but some are not. But AI can generate 20 questions. Half of them might be silly, but it's easier to send these 20 questions to the subject matter expert and say, okay, can you pick 3? It works very well, and it's removes that deer in the headlights. I don't know what I need to ask myself. AI also great in creation promotional copy and poll questions, or also we are trying, at least I was trying to create webinar snippets based on AI. There is a tool, OpusClip, which supposedly, if you load along the presentation, selects topics and little snippets, which would be more attractive for the audience on social media. I tried it several times. It didn't quite work for more content-dense webinars. But what I found, if I pre-planned these topics, so for example, I would pre-plan certain questions with the speakers, and sometimes even remove the presentation so I can have the speaker faces on the screen, I could very easily reuse these pieces of information for any other materials, for the social, for the little snippets on the website, or any other needs. And for this presentation, I actually experimented and I asked AI to generate all the images which you saw in this slide. So this little musician is fully generated by ChatGPT, as all the previous images of very sporty webinar. However, the question here is that it's not yet perfect, and I spent many hours, I would say, tinkering with these images for fun. But as I am currently in a job transition, I have the time financed by the severance package from the previous employer, which I can dedicate to investigate, to explore AI capabilities. But if you are working on your campaigns, it may not be reasonable just to spend a lot of time trying to do something with AI, which may not need to be done with AI just yet. That would be my recommendation. Do use AI where it can help you, but if it's more cumbersome, you don't have to.
Okay, that's awesome.
Otherwise, the webinar channel is in good health. It's an awesome channel to use in demand generation activities, and it could be working very well if you put it in all your marketing strategy and see how it helps you generate pipeline.
Okay, that's awesome. So tell us a story of your best performing webinar as to how you started, what happened, and what were the results. Just a use case for users.
I would probably answer this question slightly differently. When I worked for Flexport, is one of the startups in San Francisco, it was a time of COVID-19, and I would say this was the company which took advantage of the webinar program very fast and very effectively. As it was time for COVID-19, the webinar channel was the channel to use because it allowed speed and it allowed communication. There were quite a few things done which were not done in the past. For example, the production time of the webinar was compressed to probably 10% of what it would normally be. In some cases, the webinars were created in a couple of days because there was a new information available which the target audience craved. And it was possible to increase the number of sales qualified opportunities 8 times with the webinar program. Webinar program received the attention of the company because it was the program working during that time period. And also it was the time period of changing regulations in the industry, which Flexport also took advantage of and used the webinar program to generate higher interest and more pipeline from whatever was happening in the universe.
Okay, that's awesome. So again, I appreciate your all the time and effort that you put in. I've learned a lot, and I think that the user and audience will actually too. So thanks a lot for putting it together and sharing it with us. So where can people find you if they want to know more about you?
Absolutely. Please do find me on LinkedIn. Vanessa Bright, you can find me on LinkedIn. And if your company is hiring a demand generation manager, I'm happy to apply. That's my only pitch for today.
Okay. So Vanessa, again, I really loved our conversation. So happy to talk to you again later down. Okay. Look,
thank you, and it was a pleasure.
I really enjoyed it. Okay, have a nice day. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.